Hello everyone and welcome back to Newegg TV. We are very excited to be bringing you today's video because this is our new How to Build a Computer video for 2014. I'm here with Kyle and we're going to show you how to build a computer in this video and also some information on how to properly go about choosing the parts that you will install into that computer. And we actually have two separate systems that we're going to be building today. We'll also have a follow-up video that will go over more specific instructions on installing an operating system such as Windows 8.1, as well as getting drivers installed, getting the system set up how you like it, and even running some benchmarks to see how fast the system will be after you've built it. But let's start out with a really basic question. That question is, what is a computer? Sounds pretty straightforward, right? But Kyle, I think, was going to have the answer for us here, right, Kyle? Maybe, no? Aha! Kyle has procured a cell phone, actually a smartphone, and he is correct. You're absolutely correct, Kyle. That is a computer. It has all of the elements of a computer, and it's got a processor in there. It's got some memory. It's got storage. It has a display, so you can which also doubles as an interface, same way you'd use like a keyboard and mouse. And it is a computer, and it's something that a lot of people actually have right now. But smartphones aren't the only computers that have proliferated throughout the market right now that you see and interact with almost every day. We have other types of computers as well, such as... That's right, Kyle. That's a tablet. Tablets have become very popular. Chances are you maybe already own one or you're maybe looking into getting one. Tablets are very useful for doing a lot of stuff like browsing the internet, watching videos, and that type of thing. But they're not necessarily a catch-all, and they can't do everything that you might need to do with a computer, even though they might be one. So what's another option that people might have if they want to get some work done digitally? Aha! A laptop, or also known as a notebook. And that is correct. Notebook is, they've been around for a bit longer. They're larger, of course, so portability-wise, they are still portable, but maybe not so much so as a tablet or a cell phone. But again, you've got all the components you need. You've got a processor in there, you've got memory in there, you've got storage, you've got a display, you have a keyboard so you can human interface, and you've got a touchpad that kind of mimics what a mouse might do on a desktop computer. All of these computers are fantastic devices, and all of them have their place. But there is a problem that folks using a computer might run into, and that is that myself in particular, when I sit down with, say, a tablet on my couch, and suddenly I think, I want to write an email, or I want to do something even more intensive, like, say, edit video or something like that. These things are possible on the more portable versions of computers that are all over the place these days, but not quite the same as going in, sitting down at my desk, having multiple monitors in front of me to view everything, having a keyboard and mouse right there to aid in my interaction and moving around and navigating, or having the power of a desktop computer, because none of these portable devices will come close to the power that you can get with a desktop. So those are the benefits of going with a desktop computer. Not just the better interface that you can get more work done, the power that you can get by going with them, but also the ability to customize computers for your specific needs. So this here on my right is a full-blown workstation / gaming system. Actually, both of these are pretty much gaming systems, but this one's a little bit more higher end. This is an Intel-based system. We also have a slightly smaller, but still very powerful AMD system over here. We're going to be putting both of those together for you guys today. And the thing that I really like about this is that we've chosen all of these parts especially to handle gaming tasks, but also to handle lots of other things. You could easily edit video on both of these systems. You could even do other things like, I don't know, what else do you do with a computer, Kyle? Kyle does lots of stuff, so we won't really go into that. But I did want to point out one thing before we dive into the parts and some of the reasons why you might choose specific parts for a computer build, and that is that of all of the parts that you see here, and this is especially for any of you vendors who might be happening to watch this video, none of these were actually provided directly for this video by our vendors. We were kind of sneaky in that way, but most of these parts were actually drawn from what we already had on hand here at Newegg TV. For that reason, we can easily say here that none of these things are specifically sponsored directly for this video. And the other thing I really like is that we have tons of vendors here, and that's the last point I want to make in this exceedingly long intro, is that when you're choosing the parts for a computer, not only can you choose different video cards made by NVIDIA, for example, with GPUs made by NVIDIA, but you can choose from 4, 5, 6, 7 different manufacturers of those cards, all that might have different feature sets or different types of RMA support or anything like that. So you can choose your parts carefully, but you have a huge variety to choose from. Now, whenever I'm choosing parts for a new build, I usually start with the processor first, and this processor is an Intel Core i7-4790K. That's Intel's newest processor. It's AKA Haswell, at least as far as the code name of the architecture goes. And the processor is not only going to be one of the more expensive components in your computer, but it's also going to be one of the ones that you need to double check and make sure is compatible with the rest of the components. So this one happens to be socket 1150, so you want to make sure that the motherboard you get is also socket 1150, and also make sure you have additional compatibility with your motherboard. The CPU itself has a silver heat spreader on top that's going to help to dissipate the heat. And then on the bottom it has some gold contacts. You should try not to touch those because the oils from your skin can cause corrosion and possibly some connection problems. Apart from that, make sure that you're careful with these. They are delicate, and make sure you keep it in its protective packaging. And sorry, this isn't actually a 4770K box. I didn't have a 4790K box. Moving on from there, though, we need to keep the CPU cooled, and for that purpose, most processors, except for enthusiast level ones, will come with an air cooler inside the box. It's a stock heatsink fan. However, since this is an overclockable processor, the K at the end of the name indicates that, we want to give it a little bit more overclocking potential. So I've actually chosen a liquid CPU cooler in order to help keep it a bit cooler and potentially give us more overclocking headroom. This is the Enermax Liquimax 120S. This is what's known as a CLC, or a closed loop cooler. It has tubes that transport liquid over to a radiator, and then a fan that dissipates the heat from there. Now, liquid coolers are generally going to do a better job cooling. This is a 120mm one. They also have 240mm double width ones, but they tend to be a little bit more expensive as well. If you are looking to stay on budget, you might consider an aftermarket cooler that'll still perform better than the stock cooler that's in here, and often will stay quieter as well. This is a Hyper 212 Evo. This is known as a tower style air cooler. And this is a little bit more budget friendly option, but will still give you excellent cooling performance if you're looking to overclock. So there's a couple options for air coolers there. Moving on to the motherboard right here, this is the ASRock Z97X Killer Series, and this was chosen because it is compatible with our CPU. Here's the motherboard itself, by the way. The socket right there in the middle is socket 1150 that will work with this CPU, the Intel Core i7-4790K. Now, another thing to keep in mind for the motherboard is the chipset. This is the Z97 chipset used on this motherboard. And be careful, because there are some motherboards that will have a compatible socket, but not necessarily a compatible chipset. So double check the motherboard manufacturer's website, and you should be able to verify that for sure. Another thing to keep in mind with the motherboard is the form factor, or basically the size. This is a standard ATX motherboard. You'll also find micro ATX that we're going to use in the other system, and mini ITX, which is even smaller. And you want to make sure that you choose a case that will ideally fit this particular motherboard, so that is a case consideration as well. And especially for larger sizes such as eATX and XLATX, double check and make sure you get a larger size case that will fit the motherboard. There's also some cool features on this motherboard, such as an M.2 socket for next generation storage. Next up is memory, and this is a G.Skill Aries kit. So what we actually have here is 2 sticks that are 8 gigabytes each, so this is 16 gigabytes total. Now, memory is usually fairly easy when it comes to compatibility. This is DDR3, so it will work with a DDR3 motherboard. Most of the motherboards that are available right now are DDR3, although we are seeing DDR4 in the very near future. So make sure if you have a DDR4 motherboard, you get that type of memory as well. Memory is known as volatile storage, which means it only stores data as long as there is power in the system, but it is very fast. So it's important to have fast memory, especially for stuff like gaming and video editing, because you want to make sure that that data is readily available. However, remember that when you turn the computer off, the data gets flushed out of this to your permanent storage. Speaking of storage, let's talk about our storage drives next. We have multiple storage drives, and that is because there are multiple types of drives right now that you can install into a computer. I really like solid state drives because they're extremely fast. However, they're a bit more expensive, at least when you look at cost per gigabyte. This is a Crucial MX100 512 gigabyte SSD. It uses a standard serial ATA interface, so you can see the plugs down on that end. And what I usually like to do is get an SSD to install the operating system onto, such as Windows 8.1, and then go ahead and get additional storage by way of mechanical drives. And the mechanical drives we have over here are from Western Digital. These are 3 terabyte WD black drives, and they're pretty high end, but the reason that there's 2 of them is because they're going to be set up in RAID 1, which will copy data to both drives at the same time. It basically sees it as a single 3 terabyte drive, but every time you drop data onto it, copies it to both, and that way you're protected in case one of these drives fails. This also uses a serial ATA interface like you can see down there, but you're going to get a lot more actual storage capacity out of a mechanical drive right now than you do out of an SSD. So I like to team the 2 up together because they both have their merits. These are also known sometimes as peripheral drives or peripheral connections when you're considering what connects to the motherboard itself. There's another item that I have back here, which is an optical drive. These are slightly starting to fall out of fashion, so it's not necessarily something that you'll see in every single build. In fact, we aren't going to be installing one in the AMD build. But if you still have a lot of data on, say, burned DVDs or Blu-rays, for example, something like this might help. And this is a light-on drive that can play Blu-rays, and it can also burn DVDs, so you can copy DVDs to your heart's content. Rounding out our parts, we have an EVGA Supernova NEX 750B power supply. Now this is 750 watts, and wattage is definitely going to be one of the most important things to look at when you're looking at a power supply. However, that is not all. You might notice the small icon down here that says 80 plus bronze. 80 plus is an efficiency rating to determine how much of the power that's drawn from the wall the power supply actually uses. And I prefer at least an 80 plus bronze power supply, although it goes up to silver, gold, platinum, and even titanium these days if you really, really want to save on power. However, the higher up you go, generally the more expensive they are. This is a 750 watt power supply, and I actually base the wattage of this power supply more so on the graphics card than the rest of the system, since this is a gaming system and we are using this graphics card right here. This is an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 780. This is the reference design, but these are available from EVGA, Gigabyte, Asus, and even more video card vendors. The GTX 780 has a recommended power supply wattage of 600 watts, and that's for your entire system. So with 750 watts from the power supply behind here, we should have plenty of power left over, not only to power this video card, but also to keep the power supply not running at full capacity, which will help with the efficiency rating and help to save a little bit of power. Apart from that, the video card needs to have a PCI Express interface, which most video cards these days will have. This is PCI Express Gen 3, which will work with the motherboard and CPU that we have. And then the only other thing you might take into strong consideration from a video card, apart from the price, of course, because paying more will generally get you more performance, is the video out configuration, which will give you options such as DisplayPort if you want to do a 4K display, for example, DVI, which is a lot more common right now, but can go up to 2560 by 1600, or HDMI, which is incredibly popular for connecting to something like a flat screen television. However, HDMI in its current form is not ideal for 4K. So if you're really going for 4K, look for a video card that has DisplayPort 1.2 or better. And the last component for this build is the case. And if you've been watching this video up till now and thought to yourself, what the heck is going on with that case they have in the background? Well, this is actually an NZXT Phantom 630. This has a custom transfer dip applique thing on it that we had done as kind of a test, but like I said, I grabbed all these parts from within the Newegg TV studios, and I just had to use this for something. So this actually has $100 bills kind of all over it. The NZXT standard ones don't have quite as much bling going on, but my excuse for using this is that the case is often a bit more of an aesthetic statement than it is necessarily one of functionality, although cases are very, very functional as well. But choosing a case is often looking at all of the different ones that are available. Often they'll have very similar features themselves, but choosing one that suits your particular taste is often very important. Looking at other things like if they have LEDs all over it, that sort of thing, is another important consideration. The most important, in my particular opinion, would be just making sure that, again, the form factor matches what the rest of your components are. So this will, being a full tower computer case, easily fit the ATX size motherboard. And then other features such as having easily routed cable management, having drive bays in the front so you can fit as much storage as you want, having 5 1/4 inch bays up here so that you can fit stuff like optical drives or add-on fan controllers is another thing to take into consideration. And then of course build quality and things like having an interior paint job, having a side window on the side so you can look in and see your finished build after it's complete, all kind of add up to what makes a really nice case Performance-wise, the case will almost never affect how fast your computer is unless it comes down to a case being much more air efficient or much more cooling efficient than others. And by keeping your components cool, you might get better overclocking performance. But again, cases, there's a ton of them out there, a ton of variety, so take your pick from Newegg.com and make sure you check out our Newegg TV reviews for the full ins and outs of each case before you make your final decision. Now our second system here is also a gaming PC, however this one blurs the line a little bit more, and I wanted to point out here that this is sort of going towards the example of how you can build different systems to meet your needs. So whereas you might build a system specifically designed for gaming, you might also design one that's a little bit more workstation oriented like our Intel build. This one could also easily serve as an HT PC or a home theater PC. And then if you're looking to build something along the lines of just a web browsing type PC or something for viewing media, you can actually get away with even less expensive components than we've chosen here. But that said, the CPU, once again, that we've chosen here, and this is an AMD-based system. This is from AMD's A series. This is the A10 7850K. And AMD actually calls these APUs, or accelerated processing units. The reason for that is that it not only has a CPU in there for processing, but it also has a GPU or graphics processing unit in there for video. Now, the Intel actually that we're building with also has an integrated GPU, but AMD's A series has gotten a lot of credit for the performance of their APUs right out of the box. So for that reason, we're actually not going to be installing a graphics card in this particular system. Now do bear in mind that if you're looking at CPUs, they do not always include graphics across the board. So if you're looking at something like Intel's Enthusiast platform, or if you're looking for something with AMD's AM3 Plus socket, you might need that add-on graphics card as well, so bear that in mind. This particular one uses the FM2 Plus socket, so that's what we're going to need for compatibility. And then I wanted to point out one of the most distinct visual differences between AMD's and Intel's processors. The Intel one was using what's called LGA or Land Grid Array, which has a bunch of gold pads on the processor. This is a PGA processor or Pin Grid Array, which means there's a bunch of small delicate pins on the APU itself. Now you should be really, really careful with these pins because bending or, God forbid, breaking one will keep the APU from working at all. So be really careful while you're handling those and make sure that you keep them in their protective covering or just that you're really, really careful. Now, apart from this APU itself, we also have the stock heatsink fan. So here's an example of one of those. Again, these are very basic. It does come with thermal paste pre-installed on the bottom, and these will work just fine right out of the box. This also could be a potential upgrade for this system to go with something aftermarket cooling like a closed-loop liquid cooler or a tower air cooler. But for now, we're just going to use the stock one, and that should work for us just fine, although you probably wouldn't be able to overclock this APU quite as well with this as you would with otherwise. Now, of course, we've chosen a compatible motherboard for our APU, and this is the MSI A88XM gaming motherboard, and I actually have it out of the box right here to give you guys a closer look. Now, first thing you might notice is that this motherboard is smaller because this is a micro ATX form factor, which means it's shorter than the full ATX motherboard we're using with our Intel builds. Other things to note, the socket once again right there at the middle, again that's FM2 Plus, and that is the socket that we need for our AMD 7850K. Apart from that, we have memory slots over here, the rest of the components of the motherboard which are all integrated. And just bear in mind with micro ATX you are saving some space so we can use a much smaller case, but you're not going to have quite as much expansion options over here for add-on cards such as graphics cards, RAID cards, or other things like maybe a TV tuner, for example. Our memory over here, which is also from AMD, and this is the AMD Radeon R9 Gamer series. This is an 8 GB kit, so again we have two DIMMs, or dual inline memory modules. That's what those sticks are called. Now the reason we actually have two sticks for both of these builds is that both of these CPUs are capable of what's called dual channel memory mode, which improves your memory bandwidth and basically your speed and performance. So by using a matched pair of sticks, we can take advantage of dual channel mode. The other thing about this particular kit is that this is rated for 2400 speed. The faster the memory is, well, the faster the memory is, but the reason why faster memory is actually very important if you're planning to use your integrated graphics, such as in the APU over here, is that the APU is going to be using the memory for graphics memory, and faster memory, particularly with graphics, is going to give you much better performance while you're gaming. Our storage for this second build once again includes both an SSD as well as a mechanical hard drive. The SSD is the Samsung 850 Pro. This is the 128 gigabyte SSD. New SSD from Samsung, very excellent performance even with a lower capacity 128 gig model. We also once again have a mechanical drive, so this is the Seagate Desktop SSHD. This one actually has some solid state memory to help speed up the performance of the mechanical drive. This is a 2 terabyte drive, so it's going to give us once again plenty of storage for installing games or anything else that we may want to save permanently. The power supply for this system is the Rosewill Arc M550. It's a 550 watt power supply, which is actually a little bit overkill for this system as it is configured. However, I like to have an upgrade path with any system that I build, so the 550 watt power supply means that if we decide we want a little bit more gaming performance, that we can add on a graphics card and we'll have the power that we need in order to do that. Again, this is 80 plus bronze rated for efficiency, so we're going to make sure that we get nice clean power out of the wall and that we're not going to be using too much by way of heat dissipation or that sort of thing. Finally, our case is located right over here. This is the BitPhoenix Colossus. You'll note that this case is a lot smaller than the case we're using for the other build, and that is again by virtue of the fact that it is a micro ATX case, and you guys will get a much better look at this as soon as we start the build. So now that we have all the parts chosen out, let's move on to some pre-build preparation and tools. First off, I recommend clearing off your workspace. Make sure you have a nice open space to work with. Make sure it's out of the reach of, say, small pets or maybe even children, because all the parts you're working with are delicate and you don't want anyone running off with anything. Now, you've probably seen a build a computer video before, and if you have, you might have heard the old adage that all you really need is a Phillips head screwdriver. And while that is mostly true, there are a few other things that I like to keep on hand. The Phillips head screwdriver, of course, very important though. Now, you are going to want to have a mouse and a keyboard ready. You're going to need that to use the computer after you build it anyway. Also a monitor, which we have back there, and that you will use for a test boot in just a little bit. I also like to have one of these rubber mouse mats handy. That's just to lay down on the workspace. That's to protect not only your case if you're setting it on top of here, but also the workspace that you happen to be working on, if that's something that you care about. I also have some tools here for cleaning thermal paste. This is the Arctic Clean system for cleaning that. You can also use 99% isopropyl alcohol. I also have some coffee filters here, which is my preferred method just to use to clean thermal paste. Beyond that, if you want to get a little bit more into your toolkit, we have an iFixit kit right here. So this is going to include some more specific tools such as a micro screwdriver with a bunch of different tips and that sort of thing. Also, keeping a small pair of pliers handy can often be handy for removing plugs that get stuck into place and that sort of thing. Finally, you're going to want to give heed to the ever-present danger of static electricity. Now, particularly if you live in an area where you frequently get shocked when you touch a doorknob, for example, you'll want to pay special attention to this. An anti-static wrist strap is going to be an ideal solution. You just put one end on your wrist and you clip the other end to a large metal object. You can use your computer case, you can use a large metal rack, for example. You can clip it to the leg of your desk if you have a metal desk. However, if you don't have any of those things, or if you don't have the wrist strap in general, you can do a makeshift solution with your power supply. Just take your power supply, plug it into a grounded outlet, keep the power switch off, that's the 0, not the line, and go ahead and touch the housing of your power supply frequently, or at least every few minutes or so while you're doing your build. That will ground you, make sure you don't have any static built up that you can discharge to your components. Likewise, you can use this to connect to your anti-static wrist strap too, if that's available. And now we are finally ready to start building, so we're going to start off with what is called an outside-of-the-box build. The reason we do an outside-the-box build is to make sure that we don't have any defective parts. The chances of getting a defective part are pretty slim, but identifying that right off the bat rather than after you've installed everything into your case is going to help folks out a lot. So this will also be some of the initial installation, so we're going to be installing the CPU and the memory, for example, and we get those done with first. But having a reasonable surface to work on is important. And since we are going to be dropping in a video card too, there is a little bit of overhang that is needed. So actually, let me flip this around that way. And we'll set it right on top of the motherboard box. Now, don't set the motherboard on anything that could potentially be conductive, like metal, for example, is a big no-no. Even the anti-static bags that the motherboard ships in, you shouldn't use because those can sometimes be conductive as well. Let's start off with the CPU installation. For that we have the CPU itself, of course, and I'm going to be installing the stock heatsink fan that comes along with it. That's just to get ourselves started, so we'll be removing that before we do the final build. Now the CPU, again, has some gold contacts on the bottom that are you should try not to touch if you can avoid it. And what we're looking for here is a couple different elements. One is the fact that there's a couple notches on either side of the CPU, so keep an eye on where those are. The other thing is that there is a gold triangle on one corner, and that's located right down here. There's also going to be a triangle on the corner of the CPU socket. For this CPU socket, it's located right over here, and we want to make sure to line those up. And then, of course, you can also reality check where the notches are as well. Now this is the Intel build that we're working with here, so for starters I'm going to lift the retention arm on the LGA 1150 socket. That's located right here. Just push down and out to the side, and then that arm should lift up. Doesn't take too much pressure to do that. Go ahead and fold it all the way back, and the socket should actually lift up a little bit for you just like that. So go ahead and tilt that back. Now at this point the pins on the socket are exposed, so definitely make sure that you don't drop anything on there and try to keep this protected. Don't walk away from it and leave it for any long period of time or that sort of thing. Now the gold triangle once again lines up with the triangle that's printed on the PCB right there, as well as on the corner of the socket cover. And then again, the two little nubs are on either side that way. So I'm going to grip the CPU by the top and the bottom, like so. I'm going to line it up, and I'm going to drop it straight down into the socket. And bear in mind that you don't need to put any pressure down on it. It should just drop right in there. If you want to make sure it's seated right, I can give it just the lightest little jiggle right there. That'll make sure it's kind of sitting in the socket properly. And now at this point we can just close this socket. You might notice the plastic cover is still on there, but that will actually pop off by itself when you close the socket cover. So that's one way of doing that. Then you can remove that. Now the CPU is installed and good to go. Next, we're going to install our system memory. This is DDR3 memory, and if you look at the stick itself where it interfaces here at the bottom, you'll notice that there's a little notch. It's slightly off-center, so pay attention to where that is, and then take a look at the DIMM slots on your motherboard. Those are the long slots that are located right next to the CPU. You'll notice they have latches on either side, although some motherboards only have latches on one side. But you're going to go ahead and pop those open or disengage them like that, and that will allow you to install memory. A memory DIMM, a dual inline memory module. There's different ways of saying these things. But you'll want to double check your motherboard manual, because you should always have this on hand while you're doing your build. There's different things you might need to double check in here. The proper memory slots are going to be one of those, because depending on how many sticks you're installing and what type of motherboard it is, that might change from situation to situation. The memory itself though, once you've got that notch lined up, drops in very easily. Just slide it straight down into the socket, apply firm, even pressure across the top, and it will snap into place like that. It gives a nice satisfying little grabby noise when the locks actually engage. Do that again with the second stick, and now the memory is installed too. Now the CPU needs to stay cool in order to run properly. For that purpose we have a heatsink fan. The heatsink is down here, the fan is on top, and that blows air over it to keep everything nice and chilly. Now this is the stock one, and this actually isn't what we're going to be using in our final build. However, we're going to still install it right now just so the CPU doesn't overheat while we're doing our test boot. Another thing to point out is that you need thermal paste in between your thermal solution, such as this one here, and the CPU. Now this one actually has it pre-applied, and if you're using the stock heatsink fan out of your CPU box, it should come with thermal paste pre-applied. If not, well, you're going to need some more anyway to install that aftermarket heatsink fan that we're going to come around to. But just to let you know, that is already there. And then apart from that, stock CPU heatsink fan installation is actually fairly simple. This again is from the Intel side. We'll be showing you the AMD one when we get to that build. But all you're going to want to do is line up the 4 little downward firing pins with the 4 spots that are located on the 4 corners of the CPU. It should line up, and you can just kind of set it straight down on top of the CPU like so. And then it's just going to take pressure on each of these pins straight down in order to engage them. I like to start at opposite corners so you don't put disproportionate pressure on one corner of the CPU. We can do 2 at a time since this is a stock heatsink fan. And again, it'll give a little click when it latches into place. Those 2 are engaged. Now we'll do the other opposite corners. Snap one, and if it doesn't go in all the way, just go ahead and lift up the motherboard a little bit and give it another little push. And now those are all engaged. You'll note that there's also arrows on those. Those are actually for taking this off, so pay attention to those, because to remove it, you will rotate that in the opposite direction. Now the fan needs power, so we're going to go ahead and plug that in. It has a little 4-pin plug right there. And actually tucked in right here next to the DIMM slots is the CPU fan header. It's labeled on the motherboard, so double check that. Just plug that in like so. Now at this point we could actually connect up the power supply and move on with the test boot using the integrated video outs that we have here, since we do have a CPU that has a built-in graphics. We could do that with both the Intel and the AMD build. However, since that's not always the case depending on what kind of platform you might be building on, and since you might as well go ahead and test the video card as well while you're doing this, let's go ahead and pop that in at the same time. Now again, this is going to be temporary because we're going to uninstall this before we put everything in the case, but the PCI Express slot that you're going to be using is the topmost one here, the long PCI Express X16 one, and with most motherboards you're going to want to use the one that's closest to the CPU itself. That will line up with the bracket, the PCI Express brackets that is on the video card right there. Again, there is a notch that's close down to the bracket right there, so pay attention to where that is, line it up with the slot there on the socket, lower it straight down, and it should snap into place with just a little bit of downward pressure. One thing to point out here is that this video card is a little bit wobbly. It doesn't have the support that it needs right now that it will be getting from the case eventually. So pay attention to that and make sure you don't push it from one side or the other. Now the last thing we're going to do here is connect up the power supply. From the power supply we're going to need a few of the cables to provide power to our test build. We have a couple PCI Express graphics connectors. These are labeled as VGA on the power supply. Note that there's 6 pins, a 6-pin block and then an extra 2-pin block. Note there's an important distinction between these PCI Express graphics connectors that are 6+2 and the CPU supplemental connector, which is also an 8-pin block. However, it's 4 and 4, so don't get those confused. Each little plug is also keyed, so it's hard to do, but I have seen people force them in the wrong way. That's usually with a speed build or something like that, though. So let's go ahead and do the video card first, I should say, since we have these ready. There's a little latch on one side, and there's a catch on the other side, and the actual plug from the graphics card. And again, give the graphics card a bit of support while you plug these in, because it is hanging somewhat precariously right now for the test build. There's the 6-pin that we need, and then we've got an 8-pin that's going to go in next to that, like so. And then we'll just route these over and plug them into the power supply and their appropriate connectors. The power connectors that we plug in directly to the motherboard are the 24-pin main motherboard power connector, which is pretty straightforward because it's got 24 pins, and the aforementioned 8-pin CPU, which is split into 2 blocks. So again, same thing with the video card as far as plugging in goes. Just make sure that the plugs are lined up according to how they are keyed, and the little catch should grab and hold. And then finally we have the main power connector, and that's good to go. And now to perform our test boot, we're just going to plug in a monitor, a keyboard and mouse. The keyboard and mouse actually aren't even really necessary at this point. It's only there if you want to mess around in the BIOS at all, and also just to make sure that they work, of course. So I'm going to plug in the HDMI right here to our video card. If you're having trouble with the video outs, maybe try without the video card. You can also use the video outs on the motherboard. I also have a keyboard here, of course, that I'm going to plug into the USB. And some motherboards have ports that they prefer that you use for peripherals. The Fatality one has a specific mouse port here, for example. So with our mouse and keyboard plugged in, we should be all good to go. Now, the last thing we need to do here is turn on the power supply. That's important. Now, a question that might be occurring to you right about now is, how do I turn this thing on if there's no actual physical power button on the motherboard? Some motherboards have physical buttons on them that you can just use to easily turn it on and off, but that again depends on the motherboard. This one does not, so we're going to locate the front panel connectors, which are in the bottom right-hand corner of the motherboard. We're going to look for the power switch button, which is 2 little pins that are sticking out. That information will also be available in your motherboard manual. And we're going to short them or connect them briefly by connecting our screwdriver to the both of them. And we'll just tap it for a second. That's all it takes, a quick tap. And the system has powered on. At least we have initial power on. Fans are spinning, that's good. What we're going to look for is some information displaying on the screen behind us, which will be BIOS information that will tell us basic information about the board. It'll probably get to the point where it says you don't have any boot device, and from there we can say, okay, everything working on a basic level right now, so that's enough for us to go ahead and move on to the build inside the case. If you're satisfied with the efficacy of your test boot, then we can go ahead and disassemble it so we can reassemble it in the computer, in the case I should say. I'm going to go ahead and power it off the same way I powered it on, just by tapping those 2 pins again. If it doesn't want to turn off, just hold it down for a good 5 or 6 seconds and it should shut down by itself. Then we go ahead and unplug everything. So HDMI, of course, going to unplug the keyboard and mouse. And then disassembling this pretty much the same way that we assembled it. Remember that we're not going to need to take everything off of here, but we are going to need to unplug the power supply from both the video card as well as from the motherboard. And if these plugs are stiff, just hold them securely and give them a bit of a back and forth jiggle and they should unplug eventually. Graphics card just lifts right out. There is a little latch or catch, and this varies from motherboard manufacturer to manufacturer, but usually you just push it down or to the side, and again just give a little rocking motion and the video card should pull right out. From there we're pretty much good to go, but we do need to remove our heatsink fan, our stock heatsink fan, and get that cleaned up because we're going to be switching to that Enermax closed loop liquid cooler. So here again, just use those arrows, turn in the direction of the arrows, and that should disengage these 4 locks. With all 4 of those disengaged, it should lift up off of the CPU. Remember to unplug the CPU fan again from that 4-pin header. And you will note that we now have some thermal paste located right there. So I'm going to clean this off really quick. I'm going to be using my thermal material remover and surface purifier. However, you can use 99% isopropyl alcohol. That will work just fine. And coffee filters work well for actually lifting this stuff off of here. Now, one thing I've gotten a bit of negative feedback before is the way that I actually apply this stuff while the CPU is in the socket. If that's something that's a concern for you, you can remove it first. But just be careful here. You don't want to get any thermal paste out and around the socket, and you want to try to keep things clean as much as possible. But again, give this a good cleaning, and that will make sure that when you install your actual aftermarket heatsink fan, that you will get good performance. Now I've gone ahead and cleared off my work area except for the motherboard with the CPU and memory still installed. I have a thick rubber mouse mat that I'm going to use to protect my working surface as well as my case. Speaking of the case, it's time to get that out and prepared. The first thing you're going to want to do is remind yourself how money this case is, even though it really doesn't even know it. But we should go ahead and remove the side panels. Most cases are just going to have a couple screws at the back. Nicer cases will use thumb screws. And when you've got both side panels removed, you want to set them aside somewhere safe because they can often be delicate and they have plexiglass windows, and you want to make sure that they don't get scratched up. Now with the case laid on its side, I'm going to go ahead and install the motherboard. In order to do this, we're going to need a few things. One is going to be the input-output shield that goes at the back of the case to make sure that the inputs and outputs on the motherboard have a proper home and that they're also properly labeled. I'm going to need 9 screws that I will be using to screw in the motherboard, actually into the motherboard standoffs that are in this case. I would need standoffs, but fortunately NZXT has pre-installed them here. Now the one thing I do like to do before moving on with this section is to take one of the standoffs from the case, take one of the screws that I'm going to be using to mount it, and just do a little test threading to make sure that those line up. The reason for this is there's actually 2 types of screws that they use to build computers with. One is a more rough thread, one is a finer thread, and sometimes they can go back and forth. So double checking that to make sure that my 9 screws will work properly with the standoffs that are already installed in the case. I can go ahead and drop in the I/O shield. So with the labels facing out, I'm just going to go ahead and pop this in. It should pop in all 4 corners, and if you have any trouble with it and you need some extra pressure, go ahead and use the butt of your screwdriver. And with that popped in, we'll go ahead and take our motherboard. The I/O is over on this side, so we'll line that up with the back of the case. I'm just going to go ahead and install it at an angle like this, line up those I/Os, and then also make sure that the motherboard standoffs are lined up. It might take a little bit of pressure to get it pushed over and aligned with the actual standoffs, but you should be able to see them down there through the motherboard itself. Then go ahead and take your screws, and I'll start with opposite corners. And for these screws installing into the standoffs, I like to just get them snug, but don't over tighten them. If you over tighten them, then if you ever go to try to uninstall this motherboard, you might unscrew the standoff beneath it as well. Next up, we're going to be installing our aftermarket liquid CPU cooler, and here's where your experience might differ greatly from ours because there's lots of different aftermarket CPU coolers and all of them are going to install a little bit differently, but some of them do share some common features. One is that they're almost always a little bit more of a pain in the butt to install than the stock heatsink fan. One very important factor to keep in mind is that most of these are also going to have what is known as a backplate. So as you can probably see, I've just dropped the backplate on right there. Now the backplate serves as a retention mechanism to hold on the rest of the assembly that actually puts pressure up against the CPU and helps move heat away from it. But if your case does not have a nice open motherboard tray so I can actually access the backplate mount on the motherboard, then you might want to consider doing this installation before you install the motherboard in the case. That being said, after the backplate is in place, at least for this one, I'm going to install these nuts which go on top of it and provide additional mounting points for these two brackets which go on either side of the CPU block/pump. Then that simply screws into place with these 4 threaded screws. One thing you're going to need to do first though is apply a small pea-sized blob of thermal paste to the center of the CPU heat spreader, and we'll go ahead and let the block from the heatsink fan spread that out as we apply pressure to it. With the block lowered down and lined up in place, go ahead and start by threading a couple of the screws at opposite corners and then move around, tightening each screw down just a couple turns at a time until it's securely in place. And now that the CPU block is secure, we still need to attach the radiator. You can actually have done this first as well, but the choice is up to you. There's more than one way to skin a cat, just like there's more than one way to build a computer. But what I'm actually going to do is attach the radiator to the rear exhaust right here. There's, again, lots of different ways and different places you can mount this radiator in here, but for now, this is what I'm going to go with. So I'm going to start by removing this 140mm fan that comes pre-installed at the back. From there, I'm going to decide how I'm going to position the radiator, and right about there seems good. We want to make sure that the tubes don't have too much of a bend or kink in them, and also that, of course, we can easily reach over to where we're going to be mounting it to. Now, the fan positioning here is going to be very important. I only have a single fan here, so I'm just going to be doing a single push fan. Now the direction of the airflow is something you're going to want to pay close attention to. Now, most of the time, where the mount is for the motor, it means is where the exhaust is going to come out. Sometimes you actually have labels on the side of the fan that indicate which direction the fan spins and which direction the air goes. If you're really stuck, you can just plug it in and kind of see, but most of the time it's pretty evident. So I'm going to put this side on the inside of the case so it will push air out the back of the case. I'm going to go ahead and install the fan first. And the only other thing to take into consideration here is where the cable is coming off of. So I'm going to position this so that cable is closest to the back of the motherboard so I can route that cable back there and get it tucked away nice and tidy. And then from there I just have 4 more screws that I will use to mount the radiator directly to the back of the case. And the final part of our CPU cooler installation is going to be to plug the device in because we need power for both the pump here as well as the fan at the back of the case. Now we have a CPU fan header down here that is a 4-pin, and that one is made specifically for the CPU. I'm actually going to plug the fan into that plug, and that will make sure that the fan speed can be varied based on the temperature of the CPU, and that's something that the motherboard handles. And then for the pump, I'm actually going to route this over and plug it into one of the case fan headers that's tucked away back here. So now with the motherboard installed, it's actually starting to look a little bit more like a real live computer, so that's cool. What I wanted to talk about now is a few different things, and that is cable management, case fans, as well as front panel connections. These are all kind of tied together, so to speak. Now first off, we have a unique situation for case fans on this particular case, and that is that we have a little hub that's central right here that leads up to a fan controller. So all of the case fans, which are a front fan up here, an exhaust fan up here, and what will eventually be an intake fan on the other side, right over here, that pushes air in over the graphics card. are already wired up and connected to this central hub. So we don't really need to worry about that. If you're building a computer at home and you want to connect up your fans, I often recommend plugging them in directly to the fan headers on the motherboard. So there's one here, there's a couple more up here. That's a good way to do it because then you can actually use the motherboard to access the software and adjust the fan speed. But we're going to go ahead and stick with the fan controller on this one. Apart from the fans, we also have some front panel connectors that are going to plug in mostly along the bottom edge of the motherboard down here. So that will control certain things like power and reset buttons on the front of the case, USB plugs, USB 2.0 and 3.0 if those are available up there, and things like a microphone and headphone jack. Now we're going to plug those in right now because there's still plenty of space available in here to work with. And those will all come from the front of the computer case. And here's another situation where there's multiple ways to do this, but we're going to do it this way because I think it's a reasonable way to do it. So we're going to take these front panel connectors, we're going to be feeding them through these grommets to their appropriate locations, and then we'll be bringing them out and around and plugging them directly into the motherboard. The idea is to get the cables routed behind here where you can't see them as much as possible, and then only having the necessary part pop out there to plug into the motherboard itself. The other thing to keep in mind here, and this is something that you should kind of have in mind the whole time you're doing your build, is you have a limited amount of space back here. It's usually only maybe an inch, inch and a half to work with behind the motherboard tray. So having all your cables tucked away back here is your ideal situation, but having them routed in such a way that you can do that and still get the side panel on is a bit of an art. So keep in mind what's going to be plugged in where and kind of go ahead with that as you do your cable management routing techniques. And it looks like we're about ready to move on to the power supply installation. So fortunately this should be all out and ready to go from the test build that we already did. But that being said, one thing to consider here is going to be the fan orientation. Most power supplies are going to have a fan on them. Most of them are on one of the longer flat sides, although some of them do have them over here. Chances are your case will also have a grill that's specifically set up. So for the NZXT Phantom 630, we have a grill down here at the bottom that's going to let some air come in. There's also a removable dust filter right there. So we're going to take advantage of that by pointing the fan down at the back of the case. You'll notice in most cases though it does have mounting points, so you can orient the power supply either way. So depending on your situation, you may want to install it otherwise, but I'll leave that up to you guys. So I'm just going to set it in like here, just like that. And then we got the 4 screws that I'm going to mount it with on the back. Apart from that, and the cables that we already have though, which are the 24-pin main motherboard power connector, the 8-pin supplemental CPU power connector, and a couple VGA or PCI Express graphics power connectors for the video card, we're also going to be adding, since this is a modular power supply, we have separate cables, we're going to be adding some serial ATA connectivity. So I've got some SATA connectors here, just 3 of those to connect up our serial ATA SSD as well as the 2 hard drives. And then I'm also going to be connecting up one of these power connectors. These are called Molex plugs. These are a little bit more old school. They've been around a bit longer, but we're going to need at least one of these to power the fan hub that powers all the fans in the case. It is now time to install our system drives, and we have 3 of those for this particular build. So let's start off with a little bit of generic detail about storage drives in a computer. First off, there's a couple form factors or sizes of the drives themselves that you'll encounter. The SSD that we have here is a 2.5-inch form factor, and then these mechanical drives are 3.5-inch form factors. So if you're shopping for cases, you might see 2.5-inch drive bays or 3.5-inch drive bays listed, so make sure you have enough drive bays for as many drives as you want to install. The other thing to point out about these drives is that both of them, whether you're talking 2.5 or 3.5-inch, has 4 mounting locations, or basically screw holes. Now, there's also 2 different ways to mount either of these drives. So you're going to see mounting holes on either side, 1, 2, and 3, 4, or you might see mounting holes located on the bottom or the top, depending on where they put the sticker. So there's also 4 of them located there. Depending on your case and depending on the cage that you're using, you might have drives that mount from the side, like this easy mount option from our NZXT case, which uses the 4 side holes on the 3.5-inch drive to snap a bracket into place, like so. And then you just take that whole assembly and slot it into the case. Or you have the bottom mounted option like they've provided for the 2.5-inch drives. Those just line up just like that, screws into place, and then you go ahead and connect up your data cables. Now there's serial ATA connection, which you maybe are familiar with already, but that's what all of these drives are going to use. And serial ATA is very ubiquitous right now. You'll find it pretty much everywhere. So whether you're talking about a mechanical drive like this, whether you're talking about an optical drive, such as what you might install up there, or whether you're talking about even new fast SSDs, they're probably going to interface with serial ATA. There's serial ATA revision 1, 2, and 3. For the fastest speed, you want serial ATA revision 3. That's 6 gigabits per second of bandwidth, and that's what you'll definitely want if you're installing an SSD. Mechanical drives can usually be okay with serial ATA revision 2 because they don't have quite as much input-output speed. But then the other thing to point out is that even though serial ATA has been around for quite some time, and you'll find most drives these days use it, depending on when you're watching this video, you may or may not have seen the adoption of M.2 as a new form factor yet. So there's a couple new standards coming up for connecting drives. M.2 is one of them. We actually have an M.2 slot on this motherboard. It's located right here. An M.2 drive will slot in just like that, and it's pretty much just a single use. It has both data and power provided through the connection point right there. M.2 can have serial ATA drives or PCI Express drives, so make sure that you're getting the proper one to interface with your motherboard. And then we also have serial ATA Express. This motherboard also has serial ATA Express slots on it, and that's basically going to give a wider path for the data to transmit between the storage medium, such as an M.2 SSD, and the rest of the system. And as we move to faster speeds and we move towards things like 4K video, the improved performance that you're going to get with M.2 is going to be something that folks might want to look for. But not really widely available right now, but you might be seeing it depending on when you're watching this video and when you're building your system. With the drives now securely housed in their drive brackets, I'm just going to go ahead and install these to the drive cages in the case. Our Phantom 630 case has a decent amount of space in between these 3.5-inch drives, so I think these should be okay being right next to each other. But for mechanical hard drives in particular, it's best to leave a little bit of an air gap in between them since they can heat up, and you want to make sure that that heat can be dissipated by the airflow. The SSD you can pretty much install wherever. SSDs do get warm, but not nearly as much as mechanical hard drives. We'll pop that one on top. And then I'm going to connect a data cable to each one and route that over to the motherboard, and a power cable to each one and route that over to the power supply. Now, the last question here is which ports on the motherboard should you connect your SSDs or your mechanical hard drives to? It's best to use the native ports, so those are the ports that are built into the chipset. This chipset is Z97, and fortunately it has 6 full-speed SATA revision 3 6 gigabits per second ports, so pretty much we can plug it into any one of those. Some motherboards will have extra ports by means of add-on controllers. Those will still be fast, but often they'll be a little bit slower than the native ports, so only use those as backups or for additional storage or if they're needed. Finally, since we have 2 mechanical hard drives that we're going to be putting in RAID 1, we want to make sure that we connect those up to a controller that has RAID capabilities, and again, fortunately, Z97 has us covered as we do have RAID 1 support. And now we have the storage drives installed, but we can't forget the optical drive as well. This one hooks up pretty much the same way. It's also serial ATA, so just make your way to the front of the case. Fortunately, our NZXT Phantom 630 has an easily removable front 5¼ inch bay cover, so just pop that off. The drive itself is going to have, again, 4 mounting points, 2 on either side, and there's upper and lower ones. But fortunately, this has a toolless drive bay mechanism, so we don't have to necessarily worry about that. Just slide the drive in straight back, go ahead and pop open the toolless release mechanism, and with the drive lined up, you can close that up. It'll hold the drive in place, and if you're concerned about additional rotation, go ahead and secure it with a couple more screws on the opposite side from the toolless mount. And then finally, go ahead and connect up a power and data cable to it, just like you did with the storage drives. And the last serious piece of hardware we'll be installing is the video card. I saved this for last because it's kind of easy to get to from this point, but I have taken the liberty of routing our video card power cables from the power supply back behind the motherboard and pushed them out through a slot here that's fairly close to it. We do need to remove a couple brackets here at the back, so I'm just going to use my Phillips head screwdriver to do that. 2 screws, 2 brackets, and save the screws because you will use them to secure the video card. There's 1 bracket. And there's a second. And then just like we did with that test build, take the PCI Express connector right there, line it up with that top slot, line the card up with those brackets we just removed, and push it straight back into the slot. And it might take a little bit of pressure. There we go, it's popped in. Make sure that the latch right there is locked into place, and then we can go ahead and secure it with the 2 screws. And finally, we can't forget power to the graphics card, so go ahead and take those VGA power, PCI Express graphics power connectors that should already be routed right over here. You got an 8-pin going in right there, and then a 6-pin right next to it. And oh my gosh, now everything is pretty much installed. At this point, we're going to move on to cable management and tidying up some of the cables in the back. You might consider going ahead and doing one more test boot with it right now, just to make sure everything's installed properly and don't have any shorts before you tie everything down. Now, cable management may be an art form to some. It is a necessary evil to others, but the basic premise is that you want to get any cables that are in here that might be blocking airflow tucked away and tied back as best as you can. Behind the motherboard tray, you want to keep things tied down and coiled up as well. The main goal back there being just so you can put the right side panel back on without having it bulging out or being pushed out by the cables back there. The tools of the trade are going to be twist ties, which have the benefit of being very flexible, and you can snip them off to different lengths to suit your needs. However, they're a little bit more on the ghetto side. Zip ties are very, very helpful. The drawback to these is that they're one-time use, and pretty much you're going to need to snip them off unless you have really, really, really tiny fingers to undo the clasp in there, but that's hard to do. These are great to use. Just make sure you know exactly where you're going to be putting them, because again, you're probably going to have to snip them in order to get them off. The cream of the crop is probably going to be your Velcro straps. These are often a little bit wider, so they're tough to use in all different situations, but they do have the benefit of being reusable, and often they can even have a little bit of bling on them, like the power supply ones we have here have EVGA logos. So build number 1 is now pretty much good to go. As you can see here, cable management is all managed up there. One thing I did that I find myself doing commonly these days is I actually rewired those front panel connectors. So don't be afraid to unplug something, rewire it, and plug it back in if it helps out. I routed those kind of over this way. That way the power supply stuff coming up this way wouldn't overlap with that. And the litmus test is, of course, how easily we can put the side panel back on. So let me test that out. Wait. Lazy Susan is sometimes very helpful and sometimes not. All right, so side panel goes back on without any trouble. So there we go. We're going to save the moment of truth and powering on of this system until we get the second system built, because this how to build a computer video not only has one build, but actually has two. So we have the AMD build coming up next. We're going to go through that build a little bit more quickly, since a lot of the details we discussed in this one are pretty much the same from one to the next, or from Intel to AMD. We'll be focusing a little bit more on the actual CPU installation, since there's some slight variance there, as well as working with a smaller form factor system. But to spice things up this time around, since I've been doing most of the talking up till now and Kyle's been doing most of the camera work, I'm going to have Kyle do some narration for you guys and talk about stuff while I go ahead and do this build. So let's get started.
All right, Paul, let's get this build number 2 started.
Ready to go.
And underway.
Empty motherboard box for starters.
First, open the box. Always a good start. Yeah, my tutorial, guys, is going to be vastly different than Paul's, but hopefully you'll still try to make it accurate. There's the APU. Remember, we won't be using a discrete graphics card because the video output will be handled all by the CPU itself.
But we do have that option.
We do have that option, though. But for the purpose of this build, just be the APU. So
we have a graphics card that we'll be showing you guys at the end of the video that will be a very viable upgrade option for the system to increase gaming performance.
Yes, beautiful. So, you know, AMD and Intel CPUs look very alike, but they start to look a little different on the underside, as Paul had mentioned, because AMD CPUs have pins on them, whereas they're just little platforms on Intel CPUs, because all the pins are on the socket.
Now, I always like to reality check my CPUs, especially the pin grid array ones, before I install them. I can actually see that there's a couple pins here that are very, very, very slightly bent. So I'm actually going to use a razor blade to realign those before I drop it in the socket, assuming I have.
Do it at your own risk.
Yeah.
And if you guys have, like, you know, warranty plans or whatever, check the warranties on AMD and Intel CPUs. If there's a bent pin and you don't feel comfortable doing it yourself, like Paul is right now, you might want to just think about sending it back in for a replacement, because these things can be difficult sometimes, trying to straighten out that little tiny pin. But Paul's been doing this for years, so
I used to do this.
He knows what he's doing.
For RMAs in the Newegg RMA warehouse.
This is not scripted either, guys. We had no idea this pin would be bent.
There you go.
Before we started building.
Much straighter now. So if you line them up one way, then just flip the CPU 90 degrees, take a look at the others. And they're all looking pretty straight. Those weren't very badly bent or anything. It's mainly when you actually drop it in the socket, if they're bent off and it's not lining up with the hole. That's why you never try to push down on a CPU when you're installing it, is because if the pin's not aligned, you'll bend it, and those are so delicate they're easily broken. But here, just like with the Intel, we got a arrow on the corner.
There it is.
There's an arrow on the socket right down there as well. Very tiny arrow just on the corner.
There it is.
You can also look at the way that the pins are arrayed in there and kind of reality check that.
There they are.
But then for CPU installation here for AMD, it's very simple. We just have a single retention arm that lifts up on the socket right there. That'll kind of release the pinholes. Line up that arrow. Set it straight up. And this is a 0 insertion force socket, which means it should drop right down in there. Now here's a good example of it not dropping straight in. Now the last thing you want to do here is put force down on there to drop it in. I'll sometimes try to give it a little bit of a jiggle, and that might line them up, and it dropped in pretty straight there. So we're okay. But I'm going to double check here just by lifting it out really quick to make sure all my pins are still lined up. And everything's looking good, so we can go ahead and proceed. And I'll drop it back into the socket. Ta-da. And then to secure it, just go ahead and close the retention arm. And you're pretty much all set from there. So we can move on to installing the heatsink fan. For heatsink fan installations for AMD, again, we're just using the stock one here, but this only has two secure points. One is on either side. There's these little latches on either side. And AMD's been using the same heatsink fan installation for a very long time, which means there's a ton of compatibility if you are looking for aftermarket ones. But this one will serve our purposes for now. The only other thing you might want to pay attention to is where your CPU fan header comes off and where it's actually located on the board. On this board, it's located right up here, next to the memory DIMMs. So I think if we do it this way, it should be fine. We could flip it 180 degrees like that if we wanted to, but I think we'll be good for here. So the way I usually do these is I'll start with one side of that catch and I'll kind of hook it around. Remember, we've already got thermal paste on the bottom of this heatsink fan that's pre-installed, so we don't need to worry about that. And we'll go ahead and lower the other side of that so it's resting against the APU now. And on the other side, this thing has two positions. One is kind of the engage and one is the disengage. So we got it down there, and that will give us a little bit more play. We're going to give it some pressure down on top of the heatsink just to get it around that catch. And then we flip this little lever over here to the other side, and that will apply the pressure down there, and now we're pretty much set to go. And the only other thing, just like with our Intel build, just take that 4-pin CPU fan connector and plug it in right there, and then we're good to go. So in a lot of cases, you'll have an exhaust that's going to end up being situated right here. So if that's the case and you have a tower style, make sure the air is going to be pushing that way across the fins of the heatsink and then out and exhaust. Also, you might have an exhaust at the top of the case, in which case you could rotate that 90 degrees to be pushing it that way. But don't have air pushing down towards your video card, and definitely don't have air going the opposite direction towards the front of the case, except in very limited situations if you're doing something specialized with the airflow, but we'll leave that for another video.
Yes.
As Kyle said, we're going to proceed with the rest of this build, and I'm going to be moving quickly here because this is all stuff that we pretty much covered in the Intel build, and it's all pretty much the same from this point out. Once we get on to installation in the case, though, we'll be pointing out some more differences. This case has a rotated motherboard mount. So the motherboard actually is flipped upside down, and the I/O is at the top instead of at the bottom. Just something to keep in mind.
It's also important to note, guys, that when you're dealing with a smaller form factor build, like this one, for example, that's a micro ATX system, sometimes the order of operations that you're typically used to in building in a system like a full tower ATX case is different. So whereas generally speaking you'd install the motherboard and then the power supply and then so forth, sometimes that order gets switched around because you're dealing in a much smaller capacity with much less space. So you want to make sure that you read the manual of your chassis to make sure that you're installing everything in the correct order. Otherwise you could be flip-flopping around and have to unnecessarily uninstall things that you didn't foresee before.
Bitphoenix is recommending to go ahead and install, well, the case fans first, and we're not going to switch those around too much, but then we're going to move with the power supply.
Aha! So I guess that's not too uncommon. You could even install the power supply first in a full power ATX build if you wanted to. But as you can see, he's having to do a little bit extra work because we're dealing with a smaller form factor build. So here he's uninstalling that hard drive caddy. All right, so as you guys can see, this power supply is going to be mounted a little bit differently in this case because we're dealing with a smaller form factor. So instead of being mounted horizontally, it's going to be mounted vertically. And Paul's going to demonstrate that really quick.
It's an extension for the power cord.
Yes. And it's also being mounted at the front of the case, which is a bit different than what we saw on the last build. So he's going to install that extension cord, which basically just routes to the rear of the case so that when you finally have your system and you're ready to power it on, you can just plug it into the back of the case, that AC port.
There we go.
There we go. Probably have to screw it in from the bottom,
Yeah.
I'm guessing. All right, guys, so what Paul's doing right now is he's uninstalling one of the bottom-mounted fans in the case to get to the power supply bracket that's basically part of the case that you have to remove and then mount to the power supply itself before remounting everything back inside the case. This is just one of those sacrifices you have to make sometimes with smaller form factor cases. They don't just fall into place like with the money build that we just built, but sometimes vendors have quirky ways of getting all the hardware to fit inside that small space. So this is kind of one of those sacrifices they had to make. So you can see there's the power supply bracket. And actually, Paul, we tried installing it just directly to the case, thinking that we didn't have to jump through any hoops, but we quickly found out that wasn't the case.
We tried for a workaround, but you can't get at these two bottom screw mounts for the power supply without removing the bracket. You guys also might notice I'm using an electric screwdriver, which I find very helpful, but I only use it externally. I don't use it for anything internal like mounting the motherboard to the motherboard tray or anything like that.
You don't want to accidentally strip a screw in that case. You'll be in big trouble. It's always nice it's better to hand tighten those things. And so Paul's about to reinstall that bottom-mounted fan into the case, but he was just checking out the motherboard for to see how many fan connectors it had, because you always want to check how many fan headers your motherboard has before you, I guess, think about installing as many fans as you want.
I wanted to make sure that the way I position this fan, because it'll put the cable on one corner coming out, and to make that at a point where I'll still easily be able to route the cable over to reach the fan header on the motherboard. There's a tray that removes for the power supply mount with one thumb screw right here.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we kind of did a longer reach around.
We still got through it, but we could have done it easier. So props to BitPhoenix. It doesn't take as much work as we actually did to get the power supply in there.
Motherboard installation. Make sure to install your I/O shield first. Very important.
So this is set up for Mini ITX. It already has 4 of these standoffs installed, but we have a Micro ATX motherboard, so we're going to need 3 more. So actually, a correction here. There's a total of 8 standoffs that we're using for our Micro ATX motherboard. So I'm adding 4 more, and they've provided this little socket right here that can be used to tighten these down. So I'm going to be using that to make sure that these standoffs are nice and tight in the motherboard. My rule of thumb is to make the standoffs tight, or tighten them down quite a bit, and then the actual screws that go in to secure the motherboard, only do those just snug or hand tight, because you don't want the standoffs to back out if you ever go to remove the screws that are in them.
All right, it's finally time to install the motherboard. We're just going to drop it in there. Make sure the ports on the back are lined up with the I/O shield that's installed in the case. Here's a quick close look at the I/O shield with all the protective caps removed. So you just give you guys a better look at it. And of course the motherboard's installed at this point. You can see all the ports. And now Paul's just going to proceed in installing the motherboard, mounting those screws
8 of them.
8 of them, all 8 screws, making sure once again not to over tighten them, but just to make sure that they are snug, so your motherboard doesn't accidentally go falling off in the middle of the night. So when we were building the money rig, the front panel connectors were all connected to the front of the case, and we didn't really have to do too much other than plug them in straight to the motherboard. But for the Colossus here, you can see that all the front panel connectors are actually coming from the side panel itself. So Paul's going to have to do some interesting order of operations here. Once again, he's going to be installing them, plugging in all those wires directly into the motherboard first, and then he's going to actually have to install the hard drive after that, because the hard drive gets installed right on the side as well. So if he were to install the hard drive first, he'd be blocking all of those front panel connectors on the motherboard. Wouldn't be able to plug those cables in. So he's going to have to proceed with the build with the side panel kind of just hanging off the side while everything's plugged into the motherboard.
So we just got the HD audio plug up here for the mic and headphone jack, 20-pin USB 3.0, and then the ever, as always, pain in the butt front panel connectors, which I'll be doing next.
Remember, kids, if ever in doubt, RTFM. It stands for Read the Fantastic Manual. It's a code we live by here at Newegg TV. So now that we've installed the front panel connectors, we're going to install the main board motherboard power connector, 24-pin, as well as the supplemental 8-pin EPS CPU connector. Actually, this is a micro ATX board, is it? Yeah, it is 8-pin.
Yep.
Some smaller boards have only a 4-pin connector, but your power supply is most likely going to be equipped for that as well.
There's not a lot of cable management in here, small form factor, so we're going to be tucking most stuff up towards the front of the case. While we're at it, we've got a couple case fans. Both of them are right here. Both of them have 3-pin connectors. I'm going to route these up to the connectors, which are located right there, and then another one up at the front. We're going to be able to get away with one SATA power connector from the modular power supply because it has 3 plugs on it. 2 of those plugs will go to our drives, and the third will plug in here, which powers the lighting effects on the front of the case.
So once again, guys, it's very different sometimes installing hardware in a smaller form factor build. As you can see here, Paul's installing the 3.5-inch mechanical drive as well as the SSD to this removable bracket that kind of goes in the same place as the drive cage would in the Colossus. He's going to install these rubber grommets first, though, to reduce noise and vibration of the hard drive. There it is. One drive down. And then we're going to be installing the SSD on the other side of the bracket, because that's what VitPhoenix told us to do.
Unfortunately, it's difficult to do both of these at the same time because you're blocking screws one way or the other. So we'll just install this right up top, like so.
Works. Ta-da! So the drives are semi-installed. We're just going to install that bracket, and I think that's the last bit of hardware installation for this build.
And now I'm happy to say that we are pretty much finished. We have both systems all put together, and now it is time for the magic moment of powering them on for the first time. Kyle, would you like to do the honors?
Sure.
For the micro ATX system?
Absolutely. Drum roll, please. And fire.
Aha! We have a power light.
Yay.
Wow, it's very quiet.
It's booting.
Can barely hear anything.
quiet.
All right. Nice, so that's the micro ATX build. Let's go ahead and power on the big guy over here.
Yeah,
Aha,
pretty quiet.
it's powering on as well.
Sweet.
You hear little squeaky sounds from the water cooling loop as it powers up for the first time. It's going to bleed some air out of there. But at this point, unfortunately, despite all of our work, we can't actually use either of these systems yet. We could go into the BIOS or the UEFI and make some adjustments there, but we can't really actually make use of them until we install an operating system. So Windows 8.1 is what we have here. We're going to be following up this video with another video going over operating system installation on both systems, a bit of ins and outs of that. We'll also be talking about installing the drivers that will help the operating system talk most reasonably or most efficiently with the hardware that's installed in the system, and also going over some other things like setting up some initial benchmarks to test the performance and maybe some basic operating system setup and configuration stuff.
Yes.
But apart from that, Kyle, what would you do to this system if this was your system? What would you do next?
Well, you know, this is for what it is, for just having an APU in here. It does the job just fine. But if you're planning on gaming in the future, maybe at a higher resolution than 1080, or even introducing a triple panel display setup in the future, I would suggest installing a discrete graphics card in there, something like this. This is MSI's Radeon R9 270X. Here's the box right here. You get a good look at it. This is definitely a good card, and it'll really just step up your gaming power, give you a little bit more horsepower, and this case perfectly accommodates another graphics card of this length, so that'd be a perfect option.
It'll stick with the AMD theme, and since we put a slightly overpowered power supply in there, we could just drop it in and start using it without any problems. So definitely a lot still to be done, and again, that's the beauty of building your own system, that you have ultimate control over configuring it, upgrading it in the future, or even just getting in there and cleaning it out. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. We would love all of your feedback down in the comment section down below. Also, we would greatly appreciate any of the thumbs up buttons that you might be able to hit down there. So give us your likes, give us your comments. Don't forget to subscribe to Newegg TV for more videos, tutorials, overviews, unboxing, all that good stuff just like this one. And we'll see you all very, very soon.
Adios.